Lesson 102. I share God's will for happiness for me. You do not want to suffer, do you? So, have you been suffering? Have you been holding on to some pain as if it's going to buy you happiness? You may believe that holding on to anger, holding on to fear, holding on to guilt is in some way going to purchase what you want. So, how could you purchase happiness with fear or guilt or anger? It's not the currency that's used to allow yourself to be happy. I share God's will for happiness for me. You are no longer a slave to any negative emotion. Be you free today to join the happy will of God. I share God's will for happiness for me, and I accept it as my function now. So, if you have been clinging on to some false currency, some counterfeit of some negative emotion with the idea that in some way it will get you what you want, that it will in some way grant you protection or change things and how they've been, could you let go of that illusion today? Could you allow yourself what really works, happiness, to be unveiled as you release the darkness of some energy that's other than that? Could you share in God's will for happiness for you by simply choosing to let go of what is unhappy, what is other than happiness? It's just a choice. And in our innocence, sometimes we choose things that just aren't really effective in allowing for what we really want. That's okay. That's okay. They know not what they do, is what is suggested as a replacement for holding on to sin and wrong and evil. They know not what they do. I know not what I didn't know what I was doing. They didn't know what they were doing. Ignorance, ignorance. There is no sin. There is merely not knowing better at the time. So I share God's will for happiness for me. Do you share God's will for happiness for you and accept it as your function now? Let's begin releasing anything other than that to allow us to fulfill our function here. So, is there anything which you have been holding on to with the idea that it will somehow get you what you want that isn't happy? So, this could be some opinions about your body or another body you share space with. This could be some idea of something in the world that's wrong, something in your finances, something in life. And it may have seemed before as if that was something you needed to hold on to get what you want. Could you just notice whatever this thing is that you've been holding on to? It will come to mind. And once it's come to mind, could you allow yourself to let that thought drift by and notice the feeling? Could you allow the feeling? Could you feel the feeling? And could you let it go and share God's will for happiness for you? Would you let go of this unhappiness and share God's will for you? Perfect happiness. When could you let go and let God's will? I share God's will for happiness for me. You share God's will for happiness for you. And we accept it as our function now. And that's a nice idea, isn't it? Though it's one thing to know what's going to work for us, and it's another thing to experience it. What could prevent your experience of your function of happiness? Some perception of something that's unhappy, wrong, or bad in you or the world, somebody else. So, what is it that's other than your happiness, other than your function, which you've held in innocence, simply not knowing any better? And whatever comes to mind, that's okay, without judging or moralizing or stacking guilt on it. Could you allow yourself to simply feel what it feels like to be thinking some unhappy thought? Could you open up and allow up this energy that's been stuck or held consciously or likely unconsciously? Could you let it up now? Could you allow this energy to move behind some unhappy perception or thinking? And could you release this feeling? Be enlightened. Would you release this energy? When could you release and accept happiness as your function now? There's no rush. It's all that you are and will do once you've released the darkness, enlightened. You share God's will for happiness for you, and you accept it as your function now. And as you do that, anything other than happiness might arise to be brought to the light of happiness. What comes up for you? Is there anything where you've been suffering, carrying pain, holding on to something other than happiness? And it merely seemed like a good idea at the time. Did you notice how it feels when you're holding on to some suffering or pain? Could you let the thoughts drift by and allow up whatever energy had been carried or stuck? Could you notice that it's just energy, just a feeling? And could you surrender the suffering and pain? Give it up. Maybe it stays, maybe it goes. Would you surrender it? Turn it over to God and share His will for happiness for you. When could you surrender the suffering and pain and accept your happiness as your function? It's just a choice. You cannot fail to find happiness when you choose it and share God's will for you. You share God's will for happiness for you, don't you? And you accept it as your function now, do you? A happy task. And just notice you have a choice. Could you choose to share in God's will for happiness for you and accept it as your function now? Yes or no is fine. That's the freedom of power. Would you share God's will for happiness for you and accept it as your function now? And yes or no is fine. Just notice any resistance, any clinging or subscribing to a belief that something other than your happiness is what you want. When could you share God's will for happiness for you and accept it as your function now? Could you be happy that your only function here is happiness? Could you notice if you can allow yourself to be happy and loving with yourself? Could you simply notice anything that comes up other than happiness and turn it over, surrender it, allow it to release? Could you be sure that you are joining with God's will in doing this? Surrendering unhappiness, sharing in God's will for happiness for you, and accepting it as your function now. I share God's will for happiness for me, and I accept it as my function now. Well done releasing. And if you'd like to release more unhappiness, more that is not God's will for you, and sharing God's will, please join us at the link in the description where we release on your topics, whatever comes up for you, allowing it to release, to allow ourselves to be happy and fulfill our function.